Hello and welcome to another edition of Another Book Review. This week I'll be reviewing Burn It Down by Maureen Ryan. I will be talking about some sensitive subjects in terms of abuse, both of a physical and sexual nature. So if those are things that bother you, I'm not going to go into any kind of detail, but I did just want to give people a heads up in case that's something that can be upsetting to them. So just a heads up, if that bothers you, please turn this off. But I will be talking about Maureen Ryan, give you a brief rundown of her career, talk about what the book is about, talk about what I liked about it, what I didn't like about it, who I'd recommend the book to, and finish off with what I'll be reading for next time. Maureen Ryan is a film and TV critic. She has been in both Huffington Post as well as Vanity Fair, but she's been in the reporting space as a reporter in Hollywood for quite a while. She's also written, I believe, for The Hollywood Reporter as well, so she's fairly esteemed as a Hollywood reporter and has a lot of connections in the industry. What this book is kind of a hodgepodge of looks at different abuses within the Hollywood film system, mostly film and television. She touches on novels as well, which I'll touch briefly on towards the end of this video. But that's what the book is. And so she goes over, she has some famous cases, Lost. She talks about the Goldbergs and Jeff Garlin. She talks about Saturday Night Live. She talks about a show called Sleepy Hollow. So she covers all those things. She covers nepotism and Nepo babies, that concept, as well as the allegations of Evan Rachel Wood against Marilyn Manson. She has a section dealing with atonement and how people in the industry can begin to look at righting their wrongs in case they have harmed other people. And then she kind of finishes the book up with ways in the future, different practices that can be implemented by Hollywood in order to make the system a safer place for everybody. So she covers a lot of ground. I did like that there's parts of the book where she talks about conditions in Hollywood that, I believe this book came out early this year, so this is pre-strike. But she basically talks about the system for people who are below, basically off screen. So you're talking about writers, you're talking about lighting guys, you're talking about sound people, and you're talking about all these people who have jobs that have to interact with the actors and the directors. And she goes over their situation in terms of the streaming, and I think this book actually gives a really good primer for the conditions that the average person has to deal with in Hollywood, from like assistants on up. And she kind of does a good job of explaining why the conditions for the strike were ripe. This is, again, pre-strike, and so she kind of shows that this was kind of going to happen without saying, I think this is going to happen. She does say, it looks like conditions are ripe for people to step up and call a strike, because the conditions have been getting worse in Hollywood, mostly due to streaming and the lack of the 22-episode seasons that used to throw up a bunch of money in residuals. If you're someone who just doesn't have any knowledge whatsoever of Hollywood and how people are paid and how writers are paid for residuals and things of that nature, I think the book does a good job of kind of going through that. I also really liked the section on atonement. She speaks to a rabbi as well as some other individuals who have thought about what a system of atonement looks like in terms of people who have harmed and people who have been harmed. She talks briefly about a restorative justice, a woman who went through a restorative justice session or program with someone who harmed her. And I thought that section was interesting. I think that kind of raised more questions than maybe it answered, but I think she does a good job of clear-eyed saying, this is not going to be the solution in all cases, but this is maybe something to look at as a possible way of remedying this issue, as far as if someone in power harms another person, what can we do? What are some systems that we can put in place? She also talks about systems that people are beginning to put in place in terms of anonymously being able to report abuses, physical or otherwise, to folks, and going from there in terms of what studios can do. So ultimately the book, those are the things I liked about the book. And the book kind of goes through a history of different, not a history, but it goes through several different abuses that people have gone through. The section on Lost, I think, was pretty interesting, because that's a show that a lot of people have heard about and know. And the show ran, I think, till maybe 2010-ish. And she speaks to one of the actors who was on the show in the early seasons, and he left the show due to some disputed circumstances. He says that he was originally brought on to be part of an ensemble cast, and his character wasn't as developed as he would have liked. and he believes he was let go because of that conflict where he wanted more of a part in the role because his character, who was black, didn't get a chance to develop as much as the other characters who were white, and so he felt taken advantage of, and the co-creator of the show, Damon Lindelof, disputes that being the reason that he was let go. And so there's the dispute there. There's a dispute about different writers and their feelings on the show. There are people who felt there was a two-tiered system of payments, and so there was a lot of bad blood in that chapter. I found that chapter to be frustrating in the sense that she does lay out in that chapter maybe more than any of the other chapters as far as specific things that happened. A lot of times in this book there are a lot of blind items, which, while understandable, do oftentimes make it frustrating, people not using their names or using the names of the people they're accusing. And so it makes it really hard to get a full grasp of what we're actually talking about as far as something that's very vague, like, verbal harassment. Are we talking about something that is like inappropriate behavior? And so those things could be 101 different things. And so it's very hard sometimes to read the book and be like, well, I don't really know what actually happened here. And so for that chapter specifically, she's able to talk to Damon Lindelof and say, hey, this is what these accusations were. And Damon Lindelof does something really weird here where he says, in essence, in theory or in general, I could have done a better job doing all these things, but in specific, all these points that you've made against me, I'm going to categorically deny. And so it was a weird mixture of, yes, I could have been better at certain things. In general, I could have been a better showrunner and I could have handled certain situations better. But for the things that you are accusing me of specifically, I don't think those were the reasons. And so you're left with kind of just a real unsatisfactory feeling of that. She also then goes back to Damon Lindelof, who, if nothing else, if these accusations are true, basically turned a blind eye to some really pretty egregious racial behavior in terms of making people feel lesser than or insulted or belittled due to the race. And then he has something to say about people in Hollywood and how it's easier for white people than non-white people. And you're like, well, Damien, it was a weird thing to go back to him as a source after you've spent 20 or 30 pages trying to make me see him as a person who could have been better than he was, and then having him deny kind of those things. It was just kind of weird all around. The Jeff Garlin thing, she goes through the accusations of Jeff Garlin. She goes into the accusations of Scott Rudin. I think both of those were fine, and you kind of see like how terrible these people were. And those things were fine. The Saturday Night Live thing, again, is another situation where there are kind of two accusations against Saturday Night Live. One of them involved a young woman who I think was a teenager at the time, who was underage, and she has accused Horatio Sands of inappropriate behavior of a sexual nature. And apparently there were witnesses to this, but those witnesses, I guess, were not Lorne Michaels. But then she says, Lorne, her issue with Lorne, I think, is that he has not been as trying to broaden the show, being more inclusive and bringing in people of color and bringing in LGBT people at the same rate as I think she would like. And then she also feels that his style of running the show, puts people against each other and forms kind of a pressure cooker, which is one of her larger overarching points in the book, is that the Hollywood system really thrives on being a pressure cooker and puts a lot of stress on people that otherwise wouldn't need to be as stressed. And this kind of creates a lot of behaviors that wouldn't otherwise be tolerated, but they are because everyone's worried about the bottom line and worrying about getting these things up and out. And so that's really her issue with that. I wish that chapter had been either there had been more from Lorne himself. I think he doesn't respond to her request to talk on this matter, or there had been more accusations toward Lorne about him doing inappropriate things. Because this chapter felt more like, I wish that he had done something this way and he did something else. And she gets Bob Odenkirk to basically say, when we ran, I don't think he says when we ran Mr. Show it was different, but he basically calls out Lorne for his style of running the show. And he's not wasn't a fan of that. But I do wish there had been a little bit more there. And it felt a little unsatisfactory that she spends so much time that you're like, okay, well, where are we going with this thing about Lorne being like super powerful? And I'm waiting for like a villain turn to where Lorne uses his power to do evil things. And ultimately, I don't know how much you can blame Lorne, who was an adult, for behaviors that other adults did at a party he wasn't at. And so I was left a little cold with that whole section. With the atonement section, I thought that section was interesting. The problem that she has in that section, the problem that she has other places in the book, is I don't think she quite understands how strong parasocial relationships are with people. Because at one point she seems to imply like you can just get rid of people and just replace them with other people, and I don't see the problem. And that's just not how people relate to stars. It's just not how they relate to stars. And I remember reading this and going, because she does mention Louis C.K., and she just seems to think, well, you can just get rid of Louis C.K. and you just replace him with someone else. And for writers, for comedians, and for musicians, there's very much a fingerprint, and those people and their personalities, is the idiosyncrasies of that person are very much in the work. And so there are still people who have been Me Too'd to this day who I still miss. I still miss Charlie Rose. I still wish I could turn on TV and see Charlie Rose. And the problem I had with the whole atonement thing is it puts people who are fans in this position where it's like, on one hand, I don't condone abuse of anybody, but I don't know where in that process, if you have someone who in the restorative justice process can feel that there's never going to be an atonement or there's nothing anybody can do to ever make up for this thing, it makes everybody real uncomfortable. And it just is one of those things where the benefit of having a criminal justice system is it's a giant flow chart, and there's rules to it. And if you're convicted, something happens, and if you're acquitted, something else happens. Like, that's the whole thing of it working. And I understand restorative justice in theory. I've reviewed Charged by Emily Bazelon. I'll leave that link below if you want to check that out there. So I understand it in theory, but in practice, if you have a system where someone just doesn't want to have anything to do with your restorative justice thing, but you've also refused to press charges against that person, it puts everybody in just this weird limbo, Bardo Litmal space where it's like you're kind of in between stations here. And so I think that to me was frustrating. And again, when we're talking about inappropriate behavior, there are gradients to all these things, and it's a question to me of like, well, what can be done and what should be done and all those things. And I think she tries to have this system, the kind of anonymous reporting system, to try to suss some of that out. And that's one of the things that she has seen happen in terms of them beginning to put this forward. Now, whether or not it's going to be widely adapted, I think is another question. But I don't think she really ever fully wrestled and accepted that, the reason that certain people are put up with is, and Bill Murray gets mentioned a couple times, the reason that Bill Murray gets put up with by a lot of people is there are people who have very, very strong feelings about Bill Murray and Kanye West or whoever you want to put in that level. And you could tell them 100 things about this person and they will still support that person because it's a very specific parasocial relationship they have with that person. And I'm not saying that's true for everybody. I'm not saying that means that those people should be let off the hook 100%. But this is the career that these people have chosen, and you are kind of left to say, where is the line, and what do we do, and do we get rid of people permanently, and what does that look like, and does the public have a say in that? Like, who has a say in that process, and what does it look like? And so I don't think she really ever fully understood and wrestled with that fact of it being how strong that parasocial relationship is, and just say, like, you just bring someone out like the Claw and toss them and bring someone else in because everybody wants to be in Hollywood. And that's kind of the other thing is it sounds like I'm rambling, but it really is like there's a lot of issues in this book. And so the book does have a ton of hodgepodge of issues. And I think this book is actually probably pretty good for a jumping off point of discussion because I think it can go in a lot of different areas. She touches on nepotism at one point, and she doesn't really spend a ton of time on the nepotism issue. But I thought that was also kind of an interesting place to bring it. She has a very strong, there's a lot of talk about equity of different people of different backgrounds, both in the LGBT space and the people of color, people who have been excluded, women, and all these things. And so I think she really believes that it should be like 100% across the board, exactly like the population. And those are the stories that should be told. It should be a much broader set of stories. And to me, it was like, well, I think that's more true if the number of stations that someone is watching is relatively limited. But we're at the point now where there's so much content that no matter what your background and belief and system are, is you can find whatever it is you want. And so the percentages of it, to me, kept hitting on this, playing this one piano note of the percentages. And you're like, but you can find whatever content you want because Netflix and other things have blown up streaming, and there's so much stuff out there that's of relatively high quality. To me, that's not as big of an issue as it used to be. I do think it was a bigger issue before when you had 3 channels and you had, a movie a month, that to me has changed. And so to me, the percentages don't matter as much. And if she wanted to look into, well, why is it so overwhelmingly male? There's a book called The Mating Mind. I'll leave that link below if she wants to check it out, if she ever sees this video. But it kind of goes into why men would be drawn towards a profession like Hollywood, of making stories and making movies and making cultural things to impress women. I mean, that's kind of the whole point. But there's that. And then finally, the last point I'll leave on, because this video is going pretty long, she brings our friend Andy Weir into this. Andy Weir, who is the writer of Project Hail Mary, in a book that I reviewed for this channel. I'll leave the link below, to Artemis. Why she brings up Andy Weir 95% of this into this book about Hollywood, of TV and film, I still honestly, it was kind of baffling to me. So Andy Weir is a novelist who's a sci-fi novelist for people who don't know, and she mentions that he wrote a book called Artemis, which to the best of my knowledge has not been made into a movie. But there's a character in the book who is the main character, who I believe she says is Saudi Arabian descent. And in his book that's set 60 years into the future, she was upset because it felt like he, for lack of a better term, whitewashed that character and didn't really use any of her cultural background in that story. And I thought that could have used some interrogating, because I think that, if I'm not mistaken, her father is a devout practicer of a faith, and that does play some part of into the book. If I was going to defend Andy Weir, not that it's my job or anything to defend him, but he would probably say something to the effect of, well, 60 years into the future of my future, it's a much more secular society, and the cultural barriers have come down to the internet and due to all these technologies. And you can see that beginning to happen in our world, where you have people who are fans of anime in North America as much as they are in any other part of the world, or hip hop, which is a global phenomenon as far as music. You can have people who are in Korea who are huge fans of K-pop. You have people who are in Mississippi who are huge fans of K-pop. And so there's a certain amount of cultural exchange that's only going to continue to accelerate. And so what she saw in that book as this character not really having cultural ties, he may say something to the effect of, well, that's the world that I see happening. Or he may not. But he's also in a position where I wish that because she had brought up publishing, I wish she had brought up own voices and other things that the publishing world is doing to try to broaden the number of books that it's publishing from people of color in other groups. And the degree to which that's any individual author's responsibility, I think, is an interesting conversation. She doesn't really go into that, but I think that would have been interesting to say, well, if there's a character, if you're someone who is a Caucasian author, who's a white male, who doesn't want to write diverse voices, should you feel that you have to do that? And I would argue, no, you shouldn't. And it's really the job of the publishing industry to find those folks. And maybe she feels differently, but again, she doesn't really talk about that. She basically applauds Andy Weir for trying to write outside of his what he knows as being a white dude. And then she kind of dings him. Then she says that she doesn't ding him. So it was like, if he had just written another white dude, you would have dinged him. And so he's kind of between a rock and a hard place there. And that kind of irked me, because I think there's another way to handle that she doesn't really get into, but she does kind of shoehorn it into the end of this book. So I'm almost at 20 minutes. And as it's probably clear, I've had a lot of thoughts about this book. And I thought the direction of the book I thought was interesting. I think she's in the book way, way, way too much. I think she has her political opinions in the book too much. I think the book could have been condensed and focused. I think if she had focused on the overall conditions, and I think if she had focused on maybe two cases, the Lost case and the Sleepy Hollow case, I think the book would have maybe been stronger. I wish she had been able to get more people on the record, because some of these things, like I said, at one point she says that she believes it's a majority of workplaces. Towards the end of the book, she says, there are good people working in the industry. So even after reading this, I was trying to figure out what the percentage is of these workplaces where the conditions are not really conducive to people doing their best. At one point, she kind of brings George Lucas into it and other directors who in the past have kind of famously had difficult productions. And she basically says, there's this thing of men being, having to be gruff and making creativity about suffering. And it's just like, well, when you're talking about money, I think that's the root of all these things. And she also then, anyway, I've said enough. I've gone on too long. I was definitely mixed on this book. I think the book could have been much more focused than it was. I like the ending chapter where she tries to say, here are some policies that we can put forward to make the industry safer for people. And I don't think people should work in any workplace where they're feeling threatened. And I think the whole culture of Hollywood is a meat grinder, but I think it's a meat grinder because, and again, she doesn't talk about this, it's a superstar model. That's the issue with the whole thing. The issue with the whole thing is there are a lot of people on the bottom and there are very few people on the top, and it's very, very difficult to spread that around. And she notes that in terms of the worker conditions, but I don't know, excuse me, I don't know if that's ever going to change, because I don't think we're ever going to go back to a system where there are roles on television that can be 22-week seasons. So we'll see, but that to me is kind of the issue, is you're always going to have more people wanting to work in Hollywood than there are jobs in Hollywood. And I don't know how you really go about rectifying that, squaring that circle. Not to say that people should be abused or hazed, but I look at that as part of the reason that people do that. Now, again, we should have safe systems for everybody, and I think we should have clear ideas of what abuse are. And I think people should be held to account. But if you go outside of the system that you have, the legal system, I think this stuff all gets messy. And when you're talking about ending people's careers, where is that appropriate? I've gone on too long on this book. If you're interested in any of this stuff, if you're interested in Hollywood labor, I don't think this book really goes into the history of Hollywood necessarily. In the book, I think it's fair to say it has a left bent. And she brings Donald Trump up a couple times, really kind of, in my opinion, unnecessarily. But if any of those things sound interesting to you, I would say definitely give it a read. I think it is well reported for the stuff that she could get. I wish she had been able to get a little bit more. I think there should have been a little bit more meat to some of these stories. But if you're just looking to learn about some of the historical conditions that a lot of people have had to deal with in Hollywood, I think this is a good primer for that. I don't know how much revelatory stuff was there, but if you're someone who just comes in from the cold and is like, wow, there's a lot of workplace abuses in Hollywood, who would have thought it? Then you may learn a lot from this book. But that is Maureen Ryan, Let It Burn. And I will be finishing next time, XX, by Ryan Hughes. If you have read this book, please let me know. If you feel strongly about it, if you feel that there's anything that I missed in the review, if there's anything that you disagree with in the review, if there's things that you wish that she should have covered in the book, please let me know below. I think, like I said, it's a really interesting jumping off point, and if I was going to give this to a group of people, I think the conversation would be really interesting, because I think she brings up a lot of topics, and you can kind of take the book wherever you want to go after that. So until next time,